Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast about neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of people studying computational neuroscience. I am Grace.
I'm Conor.
And I'm Josh.
And the topic for this episode is brain size, how it differs across species and within species, and what that possibly means. So I think this is interesting as a topic because it's something that comes up as kind of fodder for popular science articles a lot. And I think it has some intuitive appeal that, the size of your brain should say something about your, usually intelligence, I guess, is the thing that it's correlated with, or people assume that it's correlated with. So we'll get into some of the ways in which that is kind of true, but all the caveats and that kind of thing.
So this is, just to be clear, this is kind of related to some other issues, like what social or evolutionary pressures sort of cultivate intelligence, and what about brains specifically enables intelligence. I think we won't really get into those issues much in this episode.
Well, no, we won't, because people don't have answers to that.
Yeah.
And that is part of the problem of this study, this quest to kind of figure out, how are humans so intelligent and special? Is it because of our brain sizes? And then we're like, oh wait, what do we measure when we are trying to talk about brain size, and what's actually important, and what could possibly explain how humans are different?
And kind of the whole, implicitly in the background is kind of the assumption, it's a reasonable one, I think, that humans are actually more intelligent than most or all other animals.
Yeah, we can touch on that thing because, especially lately, or maybe I've just come across it more lately, there's a sense of other animals are intelligent, they just have different things that they're good at. Yeah, and it's true, I can't echolocate or anything like that, so bats are better than me in that way, they're more intelligent than me. But
it's kind of hyper PC, right?
I was thinking about this, but it's sort of in the zeitgeist right now, where in the olden days, people would look at animals and say, what's special about humans? And would say,
and because it was obvious that there's something special about humans.
Of course, yeah. So. It's tool use, though, or it's language. And then throughout maybe the 70s, 80s, whatever, people found animals that used tools in certain contexts, or animals that used certain things that were kind of language-like in certain contexts. And so now, almost the sort of, in a way that's almost tied to political ideology or some sort of cultural ideology, there's a sense that humans are what you would expect.
Yeah, we're not unique.
We're well contextualized.
Every animal has their own niche that they excel at, and we just have ours. But ours does happen to be kind of the entire planet for the most part. So I feel like we have set ourselves apart.
So the thing about that is that we don't dominate underwater living.
Okay.
So I definitely, in a conspiratorial way, like to imagine that dolphins are secretly
more intelligent
than us, and they just don't have good limbs. And they're really frustrated all the time, looking at us being God damn it, if I had those fingers and stuff.
There's an episode of The Simpsons about that, and it's very convincing.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong hypothesis.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the differences between animals that are on land as well as some water-based animals. I guess we can start by kind of going over what things you could measure when you want to talk about brain size, because it's not so straightforward. Yeah,
so you could talk about volume. I wrote some of these down just because I wanted to think about them clearly. So in addition to volume, there's the number of cortical neurons specifically. There's the total number of neurons in all of the brain regions, including non-cortical regions. There's the brain size relative to your body size. So by brain size is often mass, I think, right? Not volume specific. So brain mass, let's say, relative to body size. And then you could also look at, hypothetically, you could look at something like neuron count relative to brain size. So, how many cortical neurons do you have relative to your brain size, which is brain mass, which is something of density. It takes into account the size of the neurons and the other kinds of cells in your brain.
Right, because just a basic overview, the brain has different regions. There's kind of the cerebellum, which is in the back and the base of the brain, and it's not really what people think about when they think of a brain, and people think of it as being related to motor coordination. And then there's the like main kind of cortical hemispheres that if you imagined a picture of the brain, you'd probably think of. And so a lot of the stuff that we looked at was kind of looking at relative number of cells in those two divisions. And then there's also all the supportive cells that aren't neurons. They're like glial cells, and they have immune functions and supportive functions and that kind of thing.
So neuron count relative to the total number of neurons. It's like the ratio of neurons to non-neurons in a brain is like another kind of thing you look at. And you could also look at, as people tend to do, discrepancy from sort of expected levels of these ratios. So for example, like if you take a whole bunch of related animals like primates and look at plot of, on one axis, one of these factors, let's say body size, and then you look at like brain mass or number of neurons on the other axis, maybe you might expect humans would deviate from this relative to other animals, which would say like relative to their body size, humans have like a really, really big brain compared to other related animals. That could be one thing you might look at.
That should be like taking into account the fact that, say for all primates, when you're bigger, you tend to have a bigger brain. But it's kind of like, do humans have an even bigger brain than you would expect given how big they are and how primate brains tend to scale with size of primate?
Yeah, that's a hypothetical one. We can talk about this.
So that's what people call, right, encephalization.
The encephalization quotient. Yeah. Okay, so those are some of the ways that we could count or quantify brain size. So where do we want to start?
Another one is something about, I think it didn't really get so mentioned in any of the papers we read. Anyway, the point is that another thing that people sometimes talk about is like connectivity. You can get into all these detailed measurements. People think things like, how thick is your cortex, or,
yeah, and
radiation between areas, does that matter for whatever? Does like the gross connectivity between areas matter? Number of synapses in a local area, these kinds of detailed things.
And the fact that connectivity between areas usually means that white matter is involved, because that's like the myelin-covered part of the neuron that's going from one brain area to like a somewhat distant brain area.
More colloquially, like the wiring is white matter.
Yeah. So I feel like that's a reasonable thing to talk about if you want to say like brain size is related to things, because you can count, or you could like measure the amount of the white matter as like a measure of brain size in a certain sense. But then if people are going to get to the level of like, well, within an individual region there's like more connectivity, like I feel like then you're just not talking about brain size anymore. You're talking about kind of micro level wiring, which is probably very important too, but then you're not asking the question of how brain size relates to things.
Right. So there's this overall question about what are the determinants of ability, probably cognitive ability, things about intelligence. And a sort of null set of hypotheses would be things related to crude measurements of differences between brains, right? So that's kind of the idea. Somehow brain size, or some of the measures of brain size we talked about, are supposed to be the most kind of obvious differences between the brains of different animals. And so people would expect them to account
for dominant factors of the differences.
And we can talk about what's implicitly meant by intelligence as well. I mean, especially in like the early days of this kind of conversation, it was just humans are the most intelligent. So what makes humans different, as we said?
And like they really were just looking for, in what sense are humans the outliers?
Right. Yeah. What measures show humans as outliers?
Yeah.
But I mean, you can also do actual testing on different species to kind of see what skills different species have or don't have. And there's things like self-recognition, like you put something on an animal's face and then see if it like notices it in a mirror and tries to remove whatever you put on its face, because it can understand that the thing in the mirror is itself. And so there's that kind of like self-awareness as a measure of intelligence. There's social interactions that happen like natively in the animal groups is kind of considered intelligent behavior, tool use, these kinds of things.
So maybe, I mean, if we we've kind of been setting up this implicit narrative, but so sort of historically people wanted to see what are the measures that humans look different on, and it does appear to be the case that if you look at body size to brain size, humans have a relatively big brain relative to their body size for related animals.
Yeah, if you plot the chart of that, humans are kind of off the line that most other animals are on. Although dolphins are not that far from humans in how far off the line they are.
This is sort of the undergraduate textbook kind of presentation level. There is a caveat to this, which is that animals, like specifically mammals that live in the water, because water is different than air, in terms of like things about how hard it is to move. Like there's obviously like things float in water. So maybe there's a bit of a caveat that water mammals might have slightly different kind of constraints on them. And so they're maybe not directly comparable according to the sort of simplest version.
Sure, it does seem like the better thing to do is to break animals up into their, evolutionary
like
tree.
Mammals,
Sure, that, or
even more specific.
Yeah, the tree of evolution, and comparing, how things compare. Because even if you do this body mass versus brain mass plot, you basically get kind of two parallel diagonal lines, and the lower one, meaning that the brain mass is kind of low for the body mass, is things like eels and reptiles and that kind of thing. And then you have like a higher line that captures a lot of mammals and birds. So it is more fair to not kind of lump all creatures together and compare, but to break it down and see what trends emerge there.
Okay, so that was the historical version, and then sort of more recently, people like Herculano Rosell,
she's a researcher in Brazil,
have attempted to look at different factors that maybe contextualize animals, like humans amongst other animals, and see what other factors might differ. And she kind of has a strong hypothesis or sort of theory that really neuron count is the most important factor. And so she kind of downplays the fact that humans have large brain to body, saying that that's maybe not a good measure. And like neuron count, or specifically cortical neuron count, is maybe the most important thing. And she basically says something along the lines of, the human brain has just the number of neurons and non-neuron cells that you would expect for a primate brain of its size. So for her, it's less about the body size, and she's just saying primate brains, including human brains, have similar, let's say, density of neurons. And so the human brain isn't an outlier in that sense. It isn't an outlier in the sort of density or neuron count sense relative to its size, the brain size. This is not contradicting earlier claims that it was high relative to body size.
Yeah, the brain is bigger than expected from body size, but the number of neurons is not more than expected for a primate brain of that size. Yeah.
Which is it's a sort of weaker statement, but there's a sense in which that's a different perspective from which the human brain is not an outlier.
To me, when I come to this thing I didn't do any neuroscience in undergrad, so I'm kind of naive about it. And when I come along, I always wonder, it's like, why are people intelligent? Is it just because we have a lot more neurons? It seems like a very reasonable kind of, once you think that neurons, this is very much the central dogma of neuroscience, that neurons are the core computational elements of the brain, then it's like, presumably having more neurons makes you more intelligent, right?
Yeah, but so there's caveats to that, of course, right? Like, as you pointed out, connectivity or something about like synapse density could affect intelligence. Yeah. And so there are other factors, and I think people aren't totally clear whether the number of neurons, we obviously we don't know at this point, right? But it's not clear yet whether the number of neurons is maybe the dominant factor, or if something about the sort of pressure with which those neurons are used. So how much do we saturate the usage of the neurons that we have?
Sure.
And so the sort of classical version, I think, is that having a large number of neurons or a large brain relative to your body size says your body, for what you can support, for the energy your body takes in, is really prioritizing its use of its brain.
But the thing is, there are examples of animals that have weirdly large brains in a variety of ways that are kind of clearly not intelligent, but they might be kind of relatively intelligent, right?
Sure.
More myrid fish, for example, have very large brains compared to other fish of similar sizes, right?
Okay. So do you specifically study this fish? It may be unfamiliar to many people. So
whatever. There's some
give a quick overview though.
More myrids are little weakly electric fish. They're these kind of funky fish that have there's two types of them. They live in Africa and Central America, or South America. So they're two different classes. Live in those two different places respectively. And they create weak electric fields that they can use for communication and for electrosensation, which is kind of analogous to echolocation in bats. But the point is just that people think that those fish are ethologically interesting, sort of unusual animals for fish of their size, kind of, and they do correspondingly they kind of show a variety of interesting behaviours and abilities, and correspondingly, they do have quite large brains. And specifically, I think they have the largest cerebellum compared to brain size and also compared to body size of, I think, any animal. I put that comment with sort of error bars, but that's somehow some extent true. A very large cerebellum. So this thing about things about efficiency and so on, you can imagine that they're related to like relative intelligence or something. It seemed, because just to me, this encephalization quotient thing is always like, oh yeah, we have a bigger brain than expected given some positive relationship between body size and brain size. But like, let's not forget about the fact that we're just bigger and therefore do have a much bigger brain. So it's kind of, there's a slightly second order feeling to that thing, which I think might be, to me, was confusing when I started thinking about it.
So like it's a confounding correlation in a sense. Like, because humans just are bigger, we have bigger brains, and then we also have bigger brains maybe for other reasons.
Yeah. But maybe we just are more intelligent, right, because we're bigger or something. You know what I mean? Like, it could just be that, right? So then we are outliers on this curve, so it's like an extra thing.
So I want to clarify that we were talking about how humans are kind of not an outlier in the sense of how many neurons they have given the size of their brain, so kind of the neural density. But it is the case that primates have a higher neural density than things like rodents. So there's a quote from this Herculano-Hoysel paper that we read. This means that a 10-fold increase in the number of neurons in a rodent brain results in a 35-fold larger brain, whereas in a primate brain, the same increase results in a brain that is only 10 or 11-fold larger. So we can just fit more neurons into a given size of brain. Primates can, compared to rodents, and so that's kind of important probably as well.
Even amongst mammals, rodents have lower brain density. And then it also turns out, based on, so when that paper was written, I don't believe they had looked at dolphin brains, but there's now a paper that has looked at dolphin brains that came out subsequently. And it turns out that dolphins and whales also appear to have lower neuron density than human brains, but it's not quite as bad as rodents.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that the number of like the supportive cells, the glial cells, and that they said that doesn't change. The density of those doesn't change across species or orders like primates and versus rodents, or even across different brain areas that may have different neural density. So it's like, I mean, if you didn't already believe that neurons were the important part, then maybe the fact that glial cells, the number of those don't even vary across all these different things, that might convince you further.
But so the upshot of this, right, is that the neuron density varies across subtypes of mammals, with primates having fairly dense brains. And if you do counts, and this was not obvious, right, that turns out elephants have, even like in just in terms of absolute numbers, fewer cortical neurons than humans.
Right. In an absolute sense, they have fewer cortical neurons. They obviously have a lot more neurons in total.
They have bigger brains, and they have more neurons, which, I don't know, I mean, you say obviously, maybe that's obvious. It turns out that a lot of them are in the cerebellum, and they have really large cerebellum.
So humans, for context, have about, the number that she gives is about 86 billion neurons in the brain. So the number you usually hear is something in the order of 100 billion. 16 billion of those are in the cortex. So it is also the case for humans. I mean, we know this, maybe not everyone knows this, that most of your neurons are in your cerebellum.
And the neurons in the cerebellum are quite small relative to the size of neurons in the cortex.
There are many, many tiny neurons.
And they're packed in pretty efficiently.
Very, very dense, yeah. But the cerebellum is not the biggest part volume-wise of the brain. So it turns out then, so from this elephant study, elephants have 257 billion neurons. So it's like, three times as many as humans, actually. But 98% of their neurons are in their cerebellum, which means that they only have 5.6 billion cortical neurons.
Which is like a third as many cortical neurons.
Even though they have 3 times as many neurons.
Yeah.
So that's that's really interesting.
Yeah, the distribution is hugely different. Yeah.
If you look at an elephant, if you took up an image of an elephant brain,
oh yeah, they're crazy.
Crazy looking things. Massive cerebellum sticking out the butt. I should mention, it'll be on the website, there's a good article and it's kind of a simple article in Nautilus about this work.
And so this is interesting, and then the prediction hypothetically is like, oh, well, maybe whales and dolphins will actually also have fewer cortical neurons than humans.
Right, because this sets it up like, oh, there's way more neurons in elephants, but elephants aren't more intelligent than humans, at least we don't think they are. I mean, it seems pretty clear. But maybe it's the cortical neurons, because we have 3 times as many.
Yeah, we're still on the quest to find the thing that makes humans an outlier, and thus the most
number of neurons, maybe.
in the cortex.
Not number of neurons, because elephants have way more neurons, but maybe it's number of neurons in the cortex. But then there's this paper from Nina Erickson, who is a researcher of some kind. What kind of researcher? Who are these people? A neuroanatomist? Is that what they call them?
You could probably be that and study this. You could also just be a marine biologist, maybe.
So they did this neuron counting business in a particular type of dolphin called a long-finned pilot whale. So as far as we now understand, dolphins are whales.
We're looking into this. Dolphins are a subtype of whale.
They're toothed whales. There are other kinds of toothed whales. Sperm whales. Right?
Yes. So a pilot whale is a dolphin, and dolphins are whales.
Yes. It turns out that they have about 37 billion neocortical neurons, which is twice as many as humans. So this clearly shows that it isn't just the number of neocortical. Assuming you think, counter to my conspiratorial tendencies, that dolphins are not as intelligent as humans, that it is not the number of neocortical neurons which determines cognitive ability.
Yeah, we could just, it would be simpler. We could say that we found the measure that matters by just accepting that dolphins are more intelligent.
But so, yeah, I mean, it's sort of a weirdness here where, I mean, I don't mean to, like, impute a political agenda, right? But there's a sense in which, like, people, it's almost like, let's try to find ways in which, there's sort of a simultaneous thrust here, like, what are the ways in which humans are discrepant? Oh, maybe it's neuron count. This becomes, like, the new, like, way that humans are better than all of the other animals. At the same time, trying to, like, contextualize the other discrepant factors and, like, sort of downplay the brain to body size ratio, where humans actually are pretty deviant.
Yeah, but dolphins are also pretty deviant.
Yeah, but again, there's this weirdness of
water. Yeah, but that, I mean,
I don't know.
They still are, though. It just was easier for them, maybe, to become that.
They are deviant, though. Like, they've got crazy things, and we can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah.
They have very interesting social structures and whatever. People are studying them behavior. So they're smart. They do smart. So
yeah.
They communicate.
I think most people, if you ask them, like, what's the next smartest species, they may say dolphin. But I don't know if they could tell you why. I mean, I don't know why. I know that they do, like, they pass the mirror recognition test.
So do magpies.
Oh, and they also, like, kill for fun.
Yeah, that's considered a measure of intelligence. There's some weird, ethological things there where it turns out that they, for example, I'm not an expert on this, but there's stories about them killing porpoises, which kind of look like neonatal dolphins to some extent.
That just makes it weirder.
And so it's like they're committing infanticide, which is a weird thing for.
There's like some Freudian
I bet you don't.
No, I mean there is in the ethology literature, people do look into the sort of unfortunate but real reproductive benefits of infanticide.
And you think this is like a cultural thing that maybe helped them to not have infanticide if they let people to start?
No, it's not necessarily. I wasn't trying to say any cultural thing, but I mean, for some animals, it is useful for. It increases the receptivity of females when the males kill infants. So the females of those
don't
species
have the infants anymore.
Don't have the infants, and then they're more likely to try to procreate again, which.
So this is like a misfiring then. They think, that's
related to, it could be the hypothesis.
I would like to know if in a dolphin's eyes, a porpoise actually looks like a baby dolphin. Like, you could, like, some outside observer might be like, a baby chimpanzee looks exactly like a baby human. Like, humans probably get confused all the time. But if dolphins are really that intelligent, they probably don't think that porpoises are baby dolphins.
I mean, it's definitely hard to know. I mean,
the mirror test thing is nonsense, no? I mean, it is the case that magpies pass the mirror test, right? I mean,
the kind of bird.
Why does that have to be? Why is that? That doesn't mean.
Birds are smarter than you think. No, well, what does it mean though? They are recognizing that the thing in the mirror is them in some way.
No, it's not. It can just be literally like you're doing the mapping correctly. You look at the thing, and you're like, oh, like when I move my limb, interesting things happens in that, and I want to move my limb until it gets to that thing there.
Yeah,
so I think possible. It's about how. I mean.
There's no
maybe some animals can figure it out with a lot of training. I don't know the specific magpie case. I mean, it's clear a lot of birds die by running into like windows.
Yeah, but maybe magpies don't. I don't know.
Yeah,
but I'm saying it's about more like the speed and kind of nature.
How quickly they figure it out.
Yeah, is it intuitive or do they have to be trained?
Maybe it is.
No, there are papers where they talk about like putting a marking on an animal and like rather quickly the animal can figure out like the first time this happens, rather quickly they can figure out. that it's that marking is on themselves.
Okay. But so on this quest, which Josh claims is political, to now find the reason why humans are so clearly superior, we have discovered by reading scientific literature that dolphins have more neocortical neurons than us, and limited in our thinking as we are by our strong paradigmatic tendencies, we are going on the assumption that dolphins are not as intelligent as human beings, and therefore it is not neocortical neuron number that determines cognitive ability.
Mm-hmm.
However, I want to point out something about dolphin brains, which I didn't know, which is kind of interesting, which is that like their cortex is actually really different to ours. There are all these kind of gross architectural features of dolphin cortex, which is different to primate cortex. Like they have different number of layers.
So for context, primates, when we look at like a human brain, for example, we tend to see something like 6 layers, roughly.
Yeah, this is just like the cells are kind of grouped in such a way that if you looked at them, you would say, oh, there's about six divisions there.
Yeah,
and
sort
so we
of
say they're layered.
Clear kind of. So dolphins, I think, have different number of layers. The distribution of neurons in the layers is very different. They, interestingly, kind of, people make claims that they don't really have a layer 4, which is weird if you know about primate cortex, because in primate cortex, you're supposed to think of layer 4 as like the input layer for like inputs from other areas to that piece of cortex, whatever. There's also a claim made, and I'm not exactly sure what this is based on, but that there kind of there isn't much prefrontal cortex.
Oh, so we can use prefrontal cortical neuron count.
This is the new.
That's our way out.
This is the next
step. So hypothetically, something about the size of certain brain regions, or specifically the size or number of neurons in prefrontal cortex or something like that.
So prefrontal cortex is kind of considered, where all the interesting stuff happens if you want to think about complicated decision making and like sense of self and that kind of thing.
Sorry, I shouldn't say prefrontal. I should say
frontal lobes. Frontal, yeah, okay. So just like the front half of the brain, roughly, upper half or so, is where...
Very crude.
We should be clear about this, right? Dolphins and whales are being like... Okay, bats are flying mammals, right? Which is ridiculous.
You sound high right now.
Bats are mammals that fly.
Yeah.
That to me is crazy. Anyway, but then, so dolphins and whales are goddamn mammals that, like, live underwater. But, so they went back in, right? I mean, yeah, they're related to...
You mean evolutionarily, they...
went back
They went back in.
Okay.
They did. They went back in.
On a very long time scale, they went back in.
We were in the water, then we left.
And I was thinking about this too when I was reading about. So whales and dolphins also have a nose on their back when you think about the blowhole. So from the evolutionary standpoint, it was the case that sort of the nose moved to the front of the face and moved to the back.
Nasal migration, it's called evolutionary.
They are disgusting.
Yeah. I think they're beautiful, but the point being, they went back into the water, which is crazy, right? I mean, it is okay, and then. They have to breathe, yeah? Like, they're not really marine in that sense. Like, they have to breathe. They have to come up. They're good at breathing, so they can breathe a lot and then not breathe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So that's the thing. Anyway, so they have that. Then, also, they have this... Oh, yeah, this weird brain. So a thing about being underwater is that you don't smell stuff as well, right?
I believe that, sure. Especially if your nose is on your back.
Massive...
Well, but you don't need the olfactory receptors, but maybe you need chemical gradient sensors of some sort.
It turns out that they have, like, hugely tiny... olfactory bulbs.
Okay.
And that like disappeared. And you can
I like the phrase hugely tiny.
Very small. They have small olfactory bulbs. And then so like then there's this thing where apparently like the size of the olfactory bulb is somehow, I didn't know this, correlated with the size of the hippocampus like in animals.
Oh,
so they also kind of have small hippocampuses.
Oh God.
So they have a very small hippocampus, which is a currently hot brain area, right? But they have a very large entorhinal cortex. So hippocampus,
which is a neighboring associated region.
The entorhinal cortex is a piece of cortex associated with hippocampus, typically in terms of like memory and space.
We didn't really talk about gyrification.
Yes.
So this is like the amount of foldiness that the cortex has, because if it's very folded, you can fit in more neurons and this sort of thing. And if you look at a rodent brain, it's like pretty sleek and smooth. And then you look at a human brain, it's got all these folds and stuff. So dolphins are kind of similarly folded to humans or more?
I think they're very foldy. But
I know it was said that it was not the case that humans are the most...
foldy.
Yeah. We'll go with foldy. But so humans are not the most in that respect.
Yeah. So gotta rule that one out.
But it's the case that neuron count is related to that foldiness because the point of having folds is to increase the surface area.
Yeah. So if you can just count neurons, then you know maybe you don't need to look at foldiness.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe before moving on to a few other related topics, we could talk about how the counting actually occurs, because this is sort of an interesting technical challenge, right? So you might say, like you might have heard in the 90s or something like this, humans have somewhere between 10 and 100 billion neurons. And if you heard it then, it would have been kind of speculative and based on...
It's a huge range. So
yeah, well, it's a large... I mean, it's one order of magnitude. It's not like... but it's a large range. Yeah. And how would you know this? I mean, the answer would be people kind of looked at small parts of brain tissue and counted by hand or, by eye and really just counted the number of neurons in some representative small part of tissue and multiplied it by some factor that they thought was appropriate to get a rough estimate, which, had like an order of magnitude uncertainty on it.
Yeah. So one of the papers we looked at wasn't really so much for its like scientific findings in particular, but it was a paper just kind of using 3 different modern methods to estimate the number of neurons. In that paper, in V1 of chimpanzees, so primary visual cortex of chimpanzees, they used 3 different methods to count the number of neurons in a single individual, and they concluded that those 3 methods all sort of agree. The idea is that there are these kind of there's these different modern methods, which that paper anyway claims are kind of mutually consistent. All of those methods depend on this idea, which you guys know more about than I do, because I am not really a proper biology person. But they all depend on this idea of being able to stain neurons with sort of dyes, fluorescent dyes that mark different things. So in particular...
So, like, just for context, there's a super common dye that's used regularly in labs for, like, just identifying neuron count and, like, stuff like this, which is called DAPI, which marks pretty clearly nucleuses of cells.
And since, your average cell is going to have 1 nucleus, you can just do a 1-for-1 count of nuclei, and then it'll tell you how many neurons there are. And as we said before, there are more than just neurons in the brain. In the human brain, there's about an equal number of neurons and supportive cells, and so you need to stain because you don't want to be counting any old cell. You want to make sure you're counting the number of neurons, or if you want to be counting the glial cells, you want to make sure you're doing that.
So they can separate the identity of glions and neurons. What?
That's what you said, glions.
Glions and neura.
So you should, yeah, okay.
Let's go glions and neura.
Okay.
So, but the point is you can count the number of glia and neurons separately if you can visually identify by morphology, for example, the distinction between them.
And then the more modern way of doing that, right, is to use some sort of genetic-y thing. Basically, there's something called, I don't know how to pronounce this. How do people pronounce this? NuN?
NuN.
So, NuN is a neuronal nuclear antigen, which is used as a biomarker for neurons. Maybe one of you guys can explain what that means.
So, I mean, antigens are sort of the way that we stain things is by using antigens, which kind of, we've taken a trick out of the immune system's toolbook, and basically we've engineered molecules that will latch on to certain things in cells, allowing us to sort of selectively isolate or visualize parts of cells.
Yeah, because immune systems can kind of produce things that attack foreign things, and so you can grab the stuff that it produces and use it to kind of attack cells of interest and attach a marker to them. And so that's why it's helpful.
So using DAPI and this NuN, you can basically, instead of having to like just look at kind of crudely visualizing tissue, you can actually kind of mark the neurons and then mark all of the cells, everything that has a nucleus, so you're kind of counting the nuclei, and then you're also able to mark the actual neurons, and there are different ways that you can go about counting these things. So broadly, the way the method that is used by most people is that essentially they like chop the brain up into pieces, and then they kind of like homogenize the brain, having stained with these different things, and then they like put bits of that brain soup under a microscope
and count the number of parts that are lit up.
which is going to be nuclei and then like neurons.
And hypothetically, there is a sort of faster way of doing this, something related to flow cytometry, where you can just take that soup and shoot it through a system that kind of makes it go through sort of single file, and there's like
Cellular
a laser.
single file, right?
The cells go through
Theoretically,
single
have a
file.
single file of cells flowing past this laser. Yeah.
Through a laser, and the laser kind of counts them as each one passes.
Yeah. And so this paper that I was mentioning claims, and then there's another method which is more of an old-fashioned thing where you take little samples of brain from kind of throughout the brain in a sort of random way, and then you, again, this is kind of very manual counting of the number of neurons in like layers, and then you use some methods to estimate the number of neurons in a volume by counting the number of neurons you see in a layer, and then you use estimation to get the number of neurons throughout the brain by considering the counts you got from your little samples throughout the brain. So this paper claims all three of those methods give pretty consistent results.
Yeah, so it's obviously all a lot of estimation from whatever sample size you want to take, and then if you're interested in how things differ across brain areas, then you have to keep your chunks of brain separate and count them separately to be able to compare.
Right, so at the beginning there'll be some stage where you're kind of carefully cutting the brain into large pieces, separating the brain areas.
Cool. So that's kind of a bit of how the counting is actually done to get these various estimates.
Yeah, it's laborious, right? So she talks about
Yeah.
how like she hires undergrads, like many undergrads, to
And
sit
pays them
there,
a bit.
pays them money to sit there and like count cells.
And so this is why we don't necessarily have a lot of great numbers for like every kind of species. It takes too long to.
Yeah, it's pretty non-trivial.
We've been getting at this issue, which kind of the upshot of it is we sort of have a feeling now that maybe it's not just neuron count, maybe it's neuron count or size or something like this in some specific regions relative to other regions or things like this. And so there's also this other paper about, I guess saucily titled, "Is Bigger Always Better?" And in this paper, they try to relate measures of general cognitive ability to surface area and cortical thickness.
So we're going from across species differences to within a species.
Within humans.
Within humans. A study is done in humans. And so that can be like pretty different as a way to compare things, but then it turns out a lot of the basic concepts still hold. Like within humans, brain mass scales with body mass. So if you have a bigger body, you'll probably have a bigger brain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're like more intelligent. You just kind of need a bigger brain to control your bigger body. And so like between males and females, males on average have bigger brains, but they on average have bigger bodies. But this study is trying to kind of delve a little bit deeper rather than just overall brain size or overall measures of neurons and this kind of thing. It's actually looking at the distribution across different brain areas. And they're kind of correlating that with something that they call general cognitive abilities, which is supposed to kind of be like IQ. It's technically, in this study...
There's a strong correlation between IQ and this general cognitive ability test, which was basically given by the armed forces, because the subjects here were all, at some point or another, associated with armed forces, though not everyone was a combatant.
Yeah, so that's the outcome that they're kind of measuring, and then they use these two different measures of interesting brain metrics, which are the surface area and the thickness, the cortical thickness.
Which cortical thickness, intuitively, we would think would have something to do with cell counts. Probably.
Yeah, it's kind of this
As
is
with
like
surface area, both of those would have something to do with cell counts.
and this is related to the gray matter, basically, not the wiring between areas, but the actual thickness and area and surface area of kind of the brain areas themselves.
And so, one of the kind of ways that this analysis, leads to thinking is that there are stronger correlations in certain brain regions with intelligence relative to other brain regions. So it's not just about the overall size of the brain necessarily. A big factor seems to be about where locally the brain is larger. So like is the frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex larger, or is a different area larger? And intelligence is positively correlated with certain areas relative to others.
And these two measures actually tend to have an inverse relationship if you look across different areas. So basically, if there's a lot of surface area in a brain region, then the cortical thickness of that region tends to be smaller. And this is kind of intuitively, if you think of kind of stretching something out, it gets wider, but it also gets thinner.
So it's like a fabric. Basically, if you think of like the surface of the brain maybe as a fabric or something like that.
Well, like silly putty, because it has to get thinner as you stretch it.
Yeah. Maybe I was thinking fabric does too. Like, I don't know, like felt.
Felt does.
Crazy fabric, Steve.
Maybe spandex a little bit, but
or
even
like,
that.
Josh wears exclusively spandex.
But like like a knit kind of thing.
I guess
push it together.
It's a terrible analogy.
Okay, silly putty's a better
clearly we should use
Play-Doh.
the putty.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
Sorry
to
shoot you down there.
Well, okay. I think the brain is has like extracellular structure. I don't know. I was just saying it kind of like felt. But okay.
Fine. For you, the brain is felt. Okay. So as you stretch it, it gets thinner. And so basically, what they were looking for is which brain regions correlate with this intelligence measure in terms of their thickness or their surface area, being needed for intelligence is kind of the test that they're getting at. And so they find that the more frontal areas, the prefrontal, lateral temporal, and inferior parietal cortices, those areas, if they have more surface area, meaning that they're usually thinner, that correlates positively with this intelligence metric. And then alternatively, you could have more surface area and thinner cortex kind of in the back of the brain, which are usually more so that the back of the brain is usually more associated with sensory processing, like the direct processing of sensory inputs. And so if you have more surface area there, then that's correlated with the lower scores on this intelligence test. But I was wondering, so this intelligence test is things like, verbal ability and arithmetic and these things, which obviously I understand why that's part of an intelligence test, but do the people who have more surface area in sensory cortices, are they better at kind of really pure sensory processing? Can they respond to tones faster or something? I don't know. That would be interesting to see.
I mean, this is getting far enough afield that I don't have a reference offhand, but I have seen work that's suggested that intelligence is correlated with certain sensory discrimination kinds of tasks.
You're saying that performance on really simple perceptual discrimination tasks is supposed to correlate with general intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it's just the case that kind of any response to an input is going to need to pass through the frontal regions, and so that's maybe the bottleneck for most people is how good your frontal cortex is.
Or taking a written test of some sort requires, sort of more some frontal area.
Sure, yeah, if it's written, that seems totally plausible.
Another thing is that we were talking earlier about gross connectivity. You can do things like you can do diffusion tensor imaging to kind of look at
the white matter. Yeah.
White matter tracts between areas, the volume of those, and so on. And people make claims about, how connected different brain areas are being important in determining intelligence by looking at individual, similar to this, right? Individual humans and variability in something like an IQ test or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's all these things.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also more. You can look in more kind of fine-grained ways about smaller brain regions and how their size is different. So things like connectivity and finer grain discrimination of brain areas. I mean, these things are kind of correlated with certain diseases, or they differ across genders on average, or there's a lot to look at. As we said, we don't really know what measure you should be thinking about. The gyrification thing, actually, this paper says is a function of the cortical expansion. So this process of the cortex spreading out like silly putty or felt, basically as it spreads out and thins, it starts to push up against itself, and the thinner the cortex, then the kind of easier it is to fold is how they describe it.
Especially given a constraint. I mean, this is all assuming the skull is not growing, right? So,
sure. Yeah.
We've talked a bunch about this, how the different size of different regions and different size across animals may play into intelligence. Maybe briefly we talk about a little bit about what motivates intelligence in terms of evolutionary factors, and specifically we've been looking at this in the context of dolphins. So one of the dominant theories for the evolution of intelligence generally in higher mammals has to do with social intelligence. And so a bunch of people in the ethology literature, for example, Seyfarth and Cheney, they talk about the social cognition as sort of a motivating evolutionary factor for the growth of intelligence broadly. And so in dolphins, it turns out that they have lots of sort of interesting behaviors, many of them social, that could motivate why they need intelligence.
Yeah, like the ability to keep track of complicated social hierarchies requires a fairly advanced brain. I mean, the way that we're saying it seems a little backwards of evolution. I guess the idea would be that some dolphin had a slightly bigger brain and could keep track of more things, and they're the ones that stuck around.
Sure.
But yeah,
or even that sort of gradually, as the environment in which an animal is living gets more complicated, it could be the environment, it could be how they hunt, how they avoid predators,
mm-hmm.
and also how they interact with conspecifics,
mm-hmm.
other animals of the same species. As all of that gets more complicated, there's a greater demand on them in terms of intelligence,
mm-hmm.
and social intelligence is a part of that. But just so like as they get into these complex situations that involve other animals and a rich environment, they need to develop intelligence, or they won't be the ones to survive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are big on the social competition hypothesis as being an explanation for, humans or apes, even elephants potentially, and dolphins and whales. In all of these cases, there seems to be a social factor that could be implicated as part of it.
The idea being that, according to all of the things we've talked about so far, what are the weird, crazy animals, right, that have like big brains? Elephants, dolphins, and certain whales, and then humans and primates. And the claim is that those animals are all kind of unusually social as well.
Are sperm whales social? Because they have large brains too, don't they? Kind of. Maybe.
Yes.
So they claim sperm whales. I mean,
are social?
In the context of the social competition hypothesis, they mention sperm whales.
Yeah. Okay. There's whales are also kind of fascinating that way. They have these weird. There's like a sense in which we don't really know what they do, which I think is crazy. Like they communicate.
They're too big.
Super large distances.
Yeah. They're just operating on a totally different scale from us.
I mean, like, there are blue whales that literally inhabit the whole planet, which is kind of nuts.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I went to a museum exhibit about whales, and I crawled inside a model of a blue whale heart. That's how big they are. You could live inside it.
Yeah. Comfortably.
Oh, yeah. It's like New York size, New York parts.
I
would happily live in a blue whale heart in New York.
The unit of measurement.
How many blue whale hearts? So the social evolution idea is kind of the answer to the why question, insofar as evolution is allowed to answer why questions. But then there's like the how, like how are we able to support, especially as humans not living in water, how are we able to support all like the energy that our brain takes, because it takes up, I think the numbers are like 20% of your body's energy, even though it's 2% of the mass or something like that. So one of the theories that's put forth is the fact that we learn to cook food, then we could get a lot more energy out of the food, and so we were allowed to have this really expensive brain that we've evolved.
Right.
And this has been tested both in terms of preferences, right, and in terms of nutrition gain. I was actually surprised by this. At some point I've seen articles at various points suggesting both that even animals who haven't eaten cooked food prefer the flavor of the taste of cooked food.
Wow. That's weird.
So it was like monkeys, if given the option to have like a cooked potato or a raw potato, preferred a cooked potato.
I love this great image of like a chimpanzee sitting down at like a nice table, like nice like serious like French, great like a nice tablecloth, like all nice cutlery.
Ordering a
nice fillet steak, like steaming.
Yeah, so I think that this is it's interesting that you would have like a preference for that that's somewhat innate maybe, and then the other related factor. Is that I think someone's done studies in terms of digestibility, suggesting that cooked food is more digestible.
Oh yeah, that's clear.
That's clear. I mean, it should be clear to some extent. But
so the idea is like the chimpanzee sits down at the restaurant and has the steak, and he's like, "Damn, this is going to be really digestible." So
their taste sensors like are well tuned to what is digestible, maybe or something like that.
You are the one who brought in the French restaurant.
Yeah.
No, I believe the study was conducted in a restaurant in Paris. Right?
But Yeah, so there's this cooked food thing, but back to social alliances for one more moment. I mean, one of the things that they were saying was a signature of complex social dynamics were nested alliances, which I just thought was an interesting concept that reminded me of maybe The Walking Dead or something, right? Humans and other animals, let's say dolphins or chimpanzees, may have evolved where there are groups, and so like there's group A and group B that might be in conflict, but inside those are groups of individuals that are sort of allies with each other. And then there are the nested alliances or nested hierarchy comes from there being groups of groups that are in competition with each other. I mean, obviously this also sounds like sort of politics or something like this, like international politics. But so apparently dolphins and chimpanzees have some signatures of these kind of nested alliances.
These hierarchies that get complicated and require a fancy
this
brain.
Guy, what's it, Richard Conor from University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, has this paper that we're talking about right now. That he's looking at bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, who, I'll just quote, live in a large, unbounded society with efficient fusion grouping pattern. Potential cognitive demands include the need to develop social strategies involving the recognition of a large number of individuals and their relationship with others. So I actually didn't know anything about this in dolphins. An interesting thing is that, as far as I understand, the idea is that there are different societies of like these different of the same kinds of dolphins, or very similar kinds of dolphins, which actually can have very different. They can have very different social structures. So I didn't address this in this paper, but an interesting thing would be to look at this is very detailed in a way, but to look at kind of differences in brains between very related animals, say particular kind of dolphins, that live in socially different settings.
They've lived in socially different settings long enough for evolution to have an impact, or these are just different groups?
Essentially cultural kinds of things.
Yeah, but in any case, the claim is that basically, one of the claims that he makes is about this kind of levels of alliance. So the idea would be that males, small groups of males, 2 to 3, will form these, what he calls first-order alliances to, quote, aid the formation and maintenance of consortships with usually one female. So you have these groups, small groups, that he calls first-order alliances. But then, this is the kind of hierarchical part, you'll also observe cooperation between first-order alliances. So between these small groups of males, you'll see cooperation between many of these small groups to actually kind of, as he says, steal females from other alliances, or correspondingly kind of protect each other's interests by kind of stopping other small first-order alliances from stealing the females that they're kind of consorting with. And those kind of second-order alliances, which are these alliances of first-order alliances, can consist of sort of 4 to 14 members, they claim. This is all based on these kind of really cool studies where they get to just hang out in this bay in Australia for years, just going around boats and videotaping dolphins. I mean, that sounds pretty good. And then the further claim is, and this is kind of less well nailed down, but that there's actually these very grand sort of social interactions between these second order alliances. So social interactions on the scale of largish kind of groups, 20-ish animals sort of competing against each other. Things like, again, I didn't read it in super high resolution, but sort of large groups competing with each other and other groups kind of observing and maybe expressing preference for one of these kind of abstract things. So some kind of brief.
I mean, to me, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm being naive, but given what appeals to people in television, or even at least the stereotypes about the dynamics in high school, it does just seem to me that this is part of people's what it does seem like a big part of human cognitive processing.
Yeah, does what you spend your brain power on.
Yeah, thinking about
modeling others.
And the social strategies and social alliances and levels of friendship and cooperation and conflict. I mean, these factors do seem to be a lot of what humans think about, aside from sort of the very basic things like raw sensory processing. I mean, obviously, you have to know how to move your arms and see things, but beyond that, it seems like a lot of our effort goes into sort of social modeling.
I agree.
So, I mean, we've actually spanned many levels here, talking about sort of brain size and maybe what motivates evolutionarily motivates the need for intelligence. And I guess we haven't talked too much from the neuroscience standpoint about the ties between brain size and intelligence, except for in this one paper that talked about the local regions. But
Yeah.
I mean, that is really like probably the least well understood part.
I would say that from what's emerged from building artificial neural networks, it's reasonable to think that the number of neurons is important. I don't think that that's kind of an absurd thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly important, right?
I mean, there's just as far as it appears, there seems to be such enormous diversity in terms of different animals having sort of different ecological niches that they're able to handle well due to sort of specialization in their brains and their behaviors. I mean, this kind of stuff gets to sort of the heart of classical neuroscience, but it is also the case that at this time, where we're deficient as a field, I think, is in linking specific intelligent functions to specific brain regions or, specific diversification. I mean, there's a lot of, on a crude level, we can do this. We know vision is done by this part of the brain roughly, and we can kind of say things. But in terms of the higher level stuff, we don't know what brain regions or what details of what brain regions support social modeling or things like that. And those are interesting questions, I think, moving forward for the neuroscience field.
Did you know, I was looking around, it turns out there are neural recordings from dolphins, actual single cellular recordings from dolphins done in Russia, back in the day.
I assume they're not awake behaving dolphins. They're probably
I think they have awake dolphins.
But they're presumably suspended in some area.
Yeah, they can't be moving.
Possibly paralyzed. I don't remember. Anyway, the point is there are single cell recordings. So there's people that actually they mapped sensory cortex and all this, that they know that auditory cortex is in a totally different place to visual cortex. Visual cortex is much smaller in dolphins than in primates, right? Auditory cortex is huge. They neighbor each other, so there's probably some kind of continuum between them, which is very different to in mammals, auditory cortex and visual cortex. So
terrestrial
claims, terrestrial mammals. Sorry.
Cool.
Anyway.
All right.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we can wrap up then. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.